The Auschwitz concentration camp, or as the Poles called it, Auschwitzum, is known throughout the world. The town of Auschwitz, or Auschwitzum, is located 50 kilometers west of Krakow. One can talk endlessly about this terrible place. The executioners did so much here in just 4.5 years. The concentration camp itself consisted of 3 parts. Auschwitz I, which existed from May 20, 1940, Auschwitz II, Birkenau, which existed from November 1941, and Auschwitz III, Monowitz, which existed at the end of 1942. Taken together, all 3 concentration camps located nearby but were separated from each other and made up the notorious Auschwitz. In addition, there were branches of this camp in Germany and other occupied territories next to industrial enterprises. Today we will talk about Auschwitzum I, or Auschwitz I as it's mostly known. Most precisely, we will be talking about one of the most terrible blocks of this camp. Actually, there were several blocks, the most horrible of which was block number 10, where sadistic doctors such as Professor Clark Klauberg and Dr. Joseph Mengele conducted their experiments on adults and children. There were also blocks for sentencing and punishing offenders, namely blocks 11 and 13. In the 11th block, the notorious police trials took place, in which so-called judges in Gestapo uniforms passed sentences on concentration camp prisoners. There could be dozens or even hundreds of such sentences per day. So we will tell you about this very block, block number 11. In addition to sentencing, there were torture of prisoners and various sophisticated humiliations. The following information may be frightening to the unprepared viewer, so be aware. The Wall of Death. Auschwitz I itself was located on the territory of former Polish and before them Austro-Hungarian barracks. 1 or 2 or 3-story building with thick bricks wall were adapted by the Germans for various blocks of the extermination camp and administrative buildings. Block 10 and 11 were connected by brick walls, forming a kind of torture yard. One of the walls was called the Wall of Death. Parts of the wall was lined with insulating material, where the executions took place. The first execution at this bloody wall took place in the fall of 1940. 75 Poles, political prisoners of Auschwitz, were executed. The execution was carried out by the SS Hauptscharführer Bernhard Palich. The Wall of Death between blocks 10 and 11 is now a memorial to the victims, where there are always wreaths, fresh flowers and lamp burning. Here, one executioner during his service personally shot more than 1,000 people at the wall. But in 1944, by the decision of the Nazi judge Gestapo officer Konrad Morgan, Palich was convicted and accused of corruption and was sent to a penal unit to the front as a punishment. There he soon perished in the battles for Hungary. Killing defenseless people is not the same as fighting. The head of the 11th block was a Gestapo officer, SS Unterscharführer Maximilian Grabner. What happened in the block? Terrible things were happening in Block 11. Those accused of violating the camp regime were locked up in special cells, approximately 90 by 90 centimeters in size. At the top of the chamber there was a 5 by 5 centimeter hole for air access. From 4 to 5 people were kept in such cells, so the prisoners had no opportunity to lie or even sit down. People could remain in this position for days. Or, for example, they spent the night in such cramped cells and during the day they were driven to work. Many could not stand it and died before the verdict of the Gestapo court. In addition to these small cells, there were also torture chambers with various so-called tools and devices for torture. One of these devices was the so-called Boger swing, named after its creator, SS officer Wilhelm Boger, who served in the political department of Auschwitz. This torture machine consisted of 2 vertical supports to which a transverse iron pole was attached. Boger, or another SS executioner, forced the victim to kneel, brought a pole under the bends of the knees, and tied the prisoner's hand to the pole. When the pole was raised, the prisoner's head was at the bottom and his bare buttocks were at the top. It was convenient for executioners to humiliate a victim in such a vile way. In the courtyard, near the execution wall, prisoners were forced to kneel, forced to raise their arms up and held in this position for hours. Those who could not stand it and gave up were immediately shot. It was here in Block 11 that Zyklon B gas was first used. This happened on September 3, 1941. Copper pipelines were installed in the basement chamber of block number 11. They supplied gas produced from pesticide in the form of granules. The first to be executed were 600 Soviet prisoners and 250 Poles. They were placed in 4 basement cells, having previously been undressed, under the pretext that they would supposedly be washed. After that, the gas was turned on. At first, the executioners did not know what concentration of gas was needed for a lethal dose. Therefore, after the first application, many victims died for several days in terrible agony. However, then camp officials increased the concentration to the required parameters, and the prisoners began to die within 10-15 minutes, after which the bodies of the victims were burned in the ovens of the crematorium. Later, when the crematoria could not cope, the bodies were burned right on the street behind the crematoria. The burning was carried out by special Sonderkommandos formed from the prisoners themselves, led by local police activists who also came from prisoners who actively collaborated with the camp administration. The duties of the Sonderkommando included organizing fires for burning bodies and disposing of burned remains, bones. Subsequently, members of the Sonderkommandos themselves became victims and shared the fate of their comrades in misfortune. Gas. A historical paradox. The gas Zyklon B was developed by the Jewish chemist Fritz Haber back in 1922 as an insecticidal substance to combat insects, pests, and household parasites such as bed bugs and other similar living creatures. This gas has no residual signs, which means that in a few minutes after its application and ventilation, the room where the gas was sprayed becomes safe. Apparently, that's why the Nazis used it, and also carbon monoxide from running engines. In the forest, members of the family of the scientist and the developer of this gas also died from the use of Zyklon B. If only Fritz had known how everything would turn out. Although the Nazi predators would still have found something to exterminate people with. Prisoners in Block 11 and in the area near it, at the Wall of Death, were hunted down by dogs, hung upside down by their feet, tortured with hot iron, nails, tongues, and other torture instruments. In addition to various sophistication, the usual brutal beating of prisoners were also used, with boots, clubs, whips, and other improvised means. Not a single day during the entire existence of Auschwitz in Block 11 did the torture of victims of fascist tyranny stop. Executions and gas killings of unfortunate prisoners also never stopped. Other tortures. Nazi executioners treated children as adult prisoners. They were punished for so-called offenses, most often for any nonsense. Children were also beaten, hunted with dogs, and forced to their knees. Exhausted kids were forced to perform various physical exercise or stand for a long time in any uncomfortable position. The fascist monster used the Boger machine and other devices to torture and abuse the unfortunate children. The executioners seemed to have nothing human. However, when they came home, they, as if nothing had happened, caressed their children and played with them. Typical behavior. At home, they were exemplary family men. But outside the home, everything changed. The interrogation of the prisoners lasted for hours. That's how Nazis fanatics kept themselves busy. The questions could be the most stupid, sometimes not even related to the accusation of the prisoner. The person was simply confused, then caught with something in his answers, and then they began to use torture and beatings. The SS Inhumans were having fun this way. It was no coincidence that block number 10 and 11 had the worst reputation among the prisoners of Auschwitz I. Getting in there meant a one-way trip. It was a scary road. According to the research, 400,000 prisoners passed through Auschwitz I. At least 20,000 of them visited the terrible block number 11, from where there was no return. In total, according to various sources, at least 1.5 million people passed through the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. Other figures are also mentioned. But more than 1 million of prisoners remained in the Auschwitz concentration camps forever. January 27, 1945 became the day of the liberation of Auschwitz for the last 7,800 prisoners whom the Germans did not have time to kill. Among them were about 200 children.